My grandson's small hand crushed mine so suddenly that I almost dropped my fork. His tiny voice trembled as he leaned closer to me, whispering words that no child should ever have to say. "Grandma, I want to leave now." "Haven't you looked under the table?" For a second, my whole body froze. Laughter rang around the wedding hall. Champagne glasses sparkled under golden light. The bride's smile glowed as if she'd already won everything she wanted. But under that table, right by the feet of my 5-year-old grandson, something was hiding, something that should never be there at a wedding, something that would burn this perfect picture to ashes. If these words already gave you chills, if you've ever felt that moment when the truth presses on your chest and won't let you breathe, please leave me a comment or a like. Your support matters more than you think. It tells me that stories like mine reach someone's heart, and that gives me the strength to keep sharing them. My name is Margaret. I'm 54 years old. I raised my son alone after his father walked away. I sacrificed my health and my happiness just to keep him on the right path. And yet tonight, at his second wedding, I sat not as a proud mother, but as an unwanted guest in the corner. My place was not next to him, not in the family circle, but at a side table with my grandson, the child nobody wanted to notice, the living reminder of a past everyone else tried to erase, the injustice cut like a knife. My son smiled for the cameras with his new bride, but he hadn't once looked toward the little boy sitting beside me. His only child, his blood, ignored as though he was invisible. The bride paraded in her silk gown, her head high, while the whispers around the tables told the truth. She was once his mistress, the reason his first marriage, the marriage that gave me my grandson, ended in humiliation. And now, in front of hundreds of people, she played the part of the perfect wife, while the boy she helped push aside clung to me, shaking, whispering that beneath this glittering celebration, beneath the very table where we sat, a darker truth was crawling. I knew then that this night would not end with cake and dancing. This night would end with fire. The applause rolled through the hall like a wave crashing against marble, heavy and endless, as my son stood at the center of it all, his arm wrapped proudly around his new bride, their faces lit up by the chandeliers above as if they were the king and queen of some fairy tale kingdom. But the shine only blinded those who wanted to be fooled, because for me, sitting at the farthest table with my grandson clinging to my side, there was no magic, no happiness, no pride, only the sharp sting of exclusion and betrayal. I had raised that man. I had walked through nights of fever and fear. I had worked 2 jobs to make sure he never missed a meal, and now that same man did not even acknowledge my presence, as though I had been erased from his story the way a child erases chalk from a board. Quick, careless, final. The arrangement of the tables was no accident, because I could see how carefully the seats had been chosen. The bride's family lined up in shining rows near the stage, each one showered with attention and praise, while the front tables filled with friends, colleagues, and smiling strangers, all of them close enough to touch the couple, to laugh with them, to be immortalized in photographs that would be framed on walls for years to come. And then there was me, placed at the far edge, the mother of the groom, the woman who had given her son life and shaped his every step, shoved to the side like a distant cousin who barely belonged, with my grandson at my elbow, the boy who should have been at his father's table, instead left to swing his legs nervously beneath the cloth, as if even the space we occupied was borrowed, temporary, undeserved. It was a cruel reminder that this wedding was not built to unite a family, but to crown a winner. And the bride had already written the script where we were nothing more than background characters, silent, disposable, invisible. When the waiters appeared with their trays of crystal, their white gloves catching the candlelight as they leaned in to pour champagne into tall flutes, I watched them glide from one smiling guest to another, and each time the golden liquid splashed against the glass, it was like a toast to our humiliation, a reminder that we did not belong. At last, one came to us, his tray dipped, his eyes sliding past me as though he did not even need to check my face, and without a word he placed a small glass of plain water in front of my grandson, not even sparkling, not even disguised with a garnish, just water, cold and ordinary, set down with the kind of carelessness that cuts deeper than cruelty. My grandson blinked, his lashes heavy, his little lips pressing together, and though he was only 5 years old, I saw it settle into him, the truth children should never feel so early, that he was not welcome, that his place at his own father's wedding was an afterthought, a burden. And then I watched my son, the father who should have defended him, raise his own glass high and speak of loyalty, of second chances, of gratitude, and the guests cheered as if those words had meaning, while all I could taste was the bitter poison of knowing he had abandoned one family to build another on top of its ashes. The bride leaned into him with the smooth grace of a woman who knows exactly how much power she holds, her diamonds flashing with each calculated move of her hand, her fingers resting lightly on his arm, claiming him in front of everyone, and then her eyes skimmed the hall until they found me. In that instant, in that deliberate glance, I saw her lips curve into the smallest, coldest smirk, a movement so slight that no one else noticed, yet it carried the weight of a slap across my face, because I heard the message as clearly as if she had whispered it in my ear. You lost, I won, and tonight everyone will see it. My chest tightened as I sat there, forced to swallow that silent cruelty, forced to keep my mouth shut while the woman who destroyed my son's first marriage now stood victorious in white silk, her head high, her lies polished into vows. Around me, the air buzzed with whispers, each one sharper than the last. She trapped him. She was the mistress. She knows how to twist any man. She knows how to take what she wants. And every phrase lodged itself in me like a thorn, twisting deeper with every laugh, every cheer, until I thought I might choke on my own silence, because it wasn't only the bride's arrogance that cut me open, it was the way the entire room accepted it, the way they applauded the thief while ignoring the wounded, the way they crowned her queen while the child she cast aside clung to me in trembling silence. By the time the maid of honor stood and raised her glass to call the bride the most loyal and devoted woman she had ever known, I thought my teeth would break from the pressure of clenching my jaw. Loyal, devoted. Lies spoken into a microphone, amplified across the hall, swallowed whole by an audience desperate to believe the fantasy they had been sold. I looked at their faces, glowing, nodding, smiling as though they were part of something pure, something holy, while I sat at my corner table staring into the darkness beneath the cloth, wondering what filth had already been planted there. My grandson tugged again at my sleeve, his small voice almost lost in the music, whispering words he thought I was too afraid to hear. "Grandma, please don't look." And that was when I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that the time for silence was already gone, because the truth was crawling closer, and it would not stay hidden forever. The music swelled again, the clinking of glasses mixing with laughter as the bride's relatives filled the air with noise, their joy loud enough to drown out any doubt. But I could no longer sit still with the weight of my grandson's words pressing down on me like a secret too heavy for a child to carry. I lowered my gaze, my heart pounding against my ribs, and with a movement so small it felt almost dangerous, I slipped my hand under the thick, white cloth and lifted just enough to let the light creep in. At first all I saw were shadows shifting, the restless shuffle of shoes that should have looked ordinary, yet there was something in the rhythm of the movement that made my stomach tighten, because this was not the simple swing of legs beneath a table. It was deliberate, slow, and intimate, And in that instant, I knew I was staring at something vile that should never belong in this room. I held my breath as my eyes adjusted, and then I saw it clearly. The polished black leather of a man's shoe sliding forward, pressing against the delicate ivory heel of the bride, their feet touching in a silent language that had no place in a marriage, much less at the very moment of vows and celebration. My throat closed as I realized the brazen cruelty of what I was seeing, because this was not an accident, not a careless brush in a crowded hall, but a dance of betrayal happening openly, shamelessly, right beneath the very table where my grandson sat with wide eyes, forced to witness a game that no child should ever even imagine. My hands shook, but I kept the cloth steady, terrified that if I let it fall too quickly, someone would notice the truth in my face before I had time to bury it. The sight seared into me, and I let the cloth drop back into place as if it were a curtain, closing on a show too filthy to watch, my fingers trembling against the linen as I forced myself to sit upright, to pretend I had seen nothing. But my pulse throbbed like a drum in my ears, and my grandson buried his small face against my arm, as though he too wanted to erase the image from his mind. Around us, the celebration thundered on, blind and deaf, the bride throwing her head back in laughter so sweet and polished that no one would ever guess the filth she was playing at under the table. And my son stood beside her, his hand resting proudly at her waist, while just a few feet away his child sat in silence, knowing far more than any child should ever know. I felt humiliated in a way that words cannot soften, because it was not just betrayal that scorched me, it was the arrogance of it, the certainty that no one would notice, that no one would dare to speak, that they could touch and tease and mock him at his own wedding without consequence, because the groom was blind with pride, the guests were drunk on fantasy, and the only witness was a trembling grandmother in the corner, with a boy too young to defend himself. And yet even in that humiliation, something shifted in me, because while the sight broke my heart, it also lit a spark, a small but undeniable fire that whispered that silence could not last forever, that one day this arrogance would collapse under its own weight, and I would be there to make sure it happened. As I sat there with the image of those secret touches still burning behind my eyes, my mind was dragged mercilessly back in time to another wedding, one far humbler, yet infinitely more genuine. The day my son stood beside a different woman, the woman who would later give me my grandson, the woman who for a time truly believed she had found a partner who would walk through life with her. That day had no chandeliers or mountains of roses, no endless line of servers carrying champagne, yet the air had been full of something purer, something that cannot be bought, because when she smiled at him, her whole face lit up with the certainty of love, and when he looked back, he carried none of the arrogance that now stained him, only the boyish tenderness of a man still learning to be a husband. I could still see the simple lace of her gown, the way her parents cried tears of joy, and the way my own heart swelled with pride, because I believed my son had chosen well, that he had chosen a woman who valued loyalty, kindness, and family above all else. In those early years, my home had been filled with the sound of their laughter, the kind that floats down hallways and makes walls feel warmer, the sound of pots, clanging in my kitchen while she cooked side by side with me, thanking me for raising a man she thought she could depend on. She brought me flowers from her own garden, not store-bought roses meant for show, but bunches of daisies and lavender tied with ribbon, little offerings that said more than expensive gifts ever could. And when she placed them on my counter, she would smile shyly, as if she were still trying to prove she belonged in our family, though in my heart she had already earned her place 100 times over. I remembered the nights when my grandson was still an infant, and she, exhausted yet determined, let me rock him so she could steal an hour of sleep. And I thought then that we were building something lasting, something that would grow stronger with each year. and I was foolish enough to believe nothing could break it. But shadows always creep in, quietly, and they entered our lives in the shape of the woman who now paraded across this glittering hall in white silk as though she had earned the crown of bride, when, in truth, she had been a thief from the very beginning. At first, she was only a whisper on his phone, a name spoken too quickly, a message hidden with a swipe of his thumb when his wife entered the room. Then it became excuses, sudden work that kept him late, nights when the bed grew colder for his wife, while he drowned himself in the poison of temptation. I confronted him once, timidly, mother to son, hoping my words could bring him back to the right path. But he brushed me off with the arrogance of a man who believed his charm would always excuse him, and the mistress, with her polished nails and smug smile, drew him further until his heart belonged more to lust than to loyalty. I will never forget the night when the truth finally shattered. His wife arrived at my door clutching her baby, her face swollen from crying, her voice breaking as she tried to speak through sobs, telling me she could no longer fight a battle that was already lost, that she was drowning in betrayal and humiliation. I had taken her inside. I had tried to soothe her trembling hands with mine. I had told her she was not alone. Yet inside me, I felt a hollowness that words could not fill, because I knew she was right. She had lost her husband to a woman who did not value vows or family, and all my promises could not change that. The cruelty of it was unbearable. While she fell apart, while she mourned the love she thought she had secured for life, the other woman grew bolder, strutting with victory in her eyes, mocking the very vows she had helped destroy. My son, blind and selfish, followed her like a moth, flying into fire, and in the end he let his good wife leave in pieces, her dignity shredded, her faith in love shattered, taking with her only the child who would now grow up in the shadow of brokenness. I had stood in silence then, paralyzed by the fear of losing my son completely if I pushed too hard, but that silence became a wound that never healed, a wound that whispered every day since that my cowardice had made me complicit. And now, years later, I sat in this dazzling hall where every candle and flower screamed luxury, watching the same woman who had poisoned my son's first marriage now standing in triumph as if she were some prize to be celebrated. The circle had closed, cruel and merciless, and the cost of my past silence was sitting right beside me, trembling and small my grandson, forced to witness his father raise a glass to honor the very woman who had stripped away the security of his childhood. The injustice pressed so heavy I thought my ribs might crack beneath it, because the first wife had managed to escape with her dignity barely intact, but he could not escape. He was trapped in this hall, his innocence poisoned by secrets, and I realized with a clarity sharper than any knife that if I chose silence again, I would betray him too, and that was something I could no longer live with. The laughter of the crowd rose like a tide, the bride's family clinking their glasses so loudly it felt like they wanted the world to hear their triumph. But while the noise crashed around me, my grandson's small body stiffened again, and I felt him press closer, as though hiding inside my arm could protect him from what he already knew was festering beneath us. I could not ignore it any longer. The pounding of my own heart demanded the truth, and with emotion that felt both reckless and inevitable, I reached again for the heavy linen, lifting it carefully, terrified that if anyone noticed, they would read the horror in my eyes. At first, it was just shadows, the restless twitch of fabric as legs shifted, but then my breath caught, because what I saw was not accident or carelessness. It was deliberate sin, hiding in plain sight, bold and mocking, as if daring me to witness. The man's shoe had moved further now, pressed firmly against the bride's calf, and this time I followed the line of her gown and saw the unmistakable curve of her hand resting against his knee under the table, her slender fingers stroking with a familiarity that had no place here. Not in front of her new husband, not in front of his child, not in front of the hundreds who cheered her as a saint reborn. My stomach twisted so violently I thought I might collapse, because it was not only betrayal, it was a performance, a private theater of cruelty staged inches from my grandson's wide, frightened eyes. The child should have been thinking of cake and balloons, but instead he sat frozen beside me, forced to carry an image so vile it would haunt him long before he even understood what it meant. As my eyes darted deeper into the shadows, I saw more, something that made my skin crawl. A phone wedged carefully against the table leg, its camera angled upward, recording every forbidden touch and every reckless gesture beneath the cloth. The realization struck like a blade. This was not just cheating. It was documentation, a trophy of arrogance, a record meant to be kept, maybe even shared. They were not hiding in fear. They were reveling in the boldness of it, confident that no one would ever dare to look, that no one would catch them because the groom was too proud, the guests too drunk, and the only witness too old and too silent to matter. My hands shook so violently I almost dropped the cloth, but I forced myself to lower it slowly, steady, as though nothing had happened, my face frozen into the polite mask of a guest, while inside my chest a storm howled. When I sat upright again, my son was laughing at something whispered into his ear, lifting his glass with blind devotion, while just behind him, his bride turned her head to hide a smile that meant something entirely different from the mask she showed him. My grandson's eyes were still wide, his breath shallow, and I stroked his hair, though my own hand trembled, because I knew now that the truth had grown too monstrous to bury, that what lived under that table was not just infidelity but open contempt, a cruelty so shameless it poisoned the air we breathed. And as the music swelled louder, drowning my thoughts, I felt the weight of it crush me, because silence no longer felt like caution. It felt like complicity, and I knew with a cold certainty that the fire building inside me would one day tear the entire facade to pieces. As I lowered the cloth and forced my face into the stiff mask of composure, the noise of the hall pressed in on me, but my mind had already retreated into its own dark corridors, where memories I had once brushed aside came back to me with a vengeance. I remembered the late-night calls my son dismissed as work, the sudden jewelry that glittered on her wrist, though he claimed they were saving money, the excuses for why she disappeared for hours without explanation, and the whispers I had overheard at the grocery store from women who spoke too loudly when they thought I was out of earshot. Each moment that had once seemed like nothing more than gossip or paranoia now linked together like pieces of a chain tightening around my son's neck, and the weight of it made me realize that what was happening beneath that table was not a slip of passion, but the culmination of a lie so carefully constructed it had devoured his entire life. I thought of the way she answered his phone once, quickly, with a sharp edge in her voice before handing it back to him, her eyes narrowing as though daring me to question it. I thought of the sudden vacations she insisted on taking without him, claiming she needed time with her cousins, though no photographs ever surfaced, no souvenirs ever returned. And I thought of the way she always seemed to know too much about his finances, slipping questions into casual conversation, probing in ways that felt more like a predator testing the bars of a cage than a wife building trust. Back then, I told myself not to meddle, not to make accusations I couldn't prove. But now, after what I had seen beneath that linen, the truth screamed so loudly inside me I wondered how I had ever doubted it. The arrogance of it was almost more unbearable than the betrayal itself, because this was not hidden in shadows, not tucked away in some distant hotel or secret meeting. It was paraded openly at the very table where his child sat, as if to mock not only my son, but the entire family. They must have thought him so blind, so desperate for the illusion of love, that he would never see the signs, and worse, they must have thought me so old and powerless that even if I noticed, I would remain silent. That realization seared me more deeply than anything else, because it wasn't just my son they had made a fool of. It was me, the mother who had sacrificed everything, the grandmother who sat powerless, the woman they counted on to stay quiet. Their contempt was total, and it left me shaking with a rage so sharp I could taste blood at the back of my throat. And yet beneath that fury there was something else, something colder, a realization that if I had the strength to weave these fragments together into truth, then I might also have the strength to unravel their entire web in front of everyone who now cheered them. I did not yet know how, I did not yet see the path, but I felt the beginnings of a plan take root inside me, a whisper of possibility that perhaps silence was not my destiny after all. The lies they thought were unbreakable had cracks, and I had just placed my hand upon one. I knew then that one day soon, when the moment was right, I would press, and the whole fragile facade would collapse in ruins at their feet. The hall shimmered with laughter and music, the clinking of cutlery against porcelain, the clatter of heels across polished floors, all of it blending into a single deafening noise that seemed to mock the storm raging inside me. I sat rigid, my grandson pressed against my side, his small body trembling, his eyes darting from the glowing bride to the shadows beneath the table, as though he too carried the burden of what we both had seen. My lips ached with the weight of unspoken truth. My tongue felt heavy with words that begged to be shouted into the room, yet I swallowed them down, because to speak them now would unleash a chaos my son was not ready to face. Each second I stayed silent felt like swallowing broken glass, sharp and jagged, tearing at the edges of my soul. I watched my son raise another glass, his face flushed with wine and pride, and it made me sick to see how blind he was, how he stood in front of hundreds of people, celebrating a future already rotting at its core. He spoke of loyalty, of love, of building something lasting, and the guests clapped as though the words were gospel, their eyes glowing with envy of a fairy tale they thought was real. Only I knew the truth. Only I and the frightened boy beside me carried the knowledge that those vows were a lie, that even as he spoke them, his bride betrayed him within arm's reach. I wanted to rise, to scream, to tear down the illusion, but I forced myself to sit still, my nails digging into my palms until I felt pain, because I knew that one wrong move would make me look like the jealous old woman, bitter and unwanted, while the true villainess stood untouchable in silk and diamonds. Every laugh from the crowd scraped across my nerves. Every cheer felt like an insult, because while they toasted to happiness, my grandson sat in silence, his childhood innocence already poisoned by secrets far too heavy for his small shoulders. He leaned closer to me, whispering that he wanted to go home, his voice so soft it nearly broke me. But I kissed his hair and told him we had to stay, because leaving would only give them more power. Leaving would mean letting her win. Still, my heart cracked with each moment, because I knew he did not deserve to carry the weight of silence with me, yet here we were, bound together in a prison of deceit, surrounded by people too blind or too careless to see the truth screaming at their feet. And so I sat there, smiling when expected, clapping at speeches, nodding at jokes, playing my part as though I were just another guest, while inside I screamed. My silence grew heavier with every minute, pressing down until I could barely breathe. But I knew I had to wait. I had to bide my time, because if the truth was going to explode, it had to be undeniable in a way that no one could twist or cover. It was not yet my moment, but it was coming. I could feel it building, like thunder behind the clouds, and when it finally broke, the silence that once suffocated me would become the weapon that destroyed them. As the music swelled and the guests roared with laughter over some joke I could not hear, I felt my grandson shift uneasily beside me, his small frame rigid with the kind of tension that belongs to someone carrying a secret too heavy for his age. His hand tugged gently at my sleeve until I bent my head closer, and then he whispered words that sent a shiver down my spine. He told me this was not the first time he had seen the bride, with the man lurking in the shadows under the table. He said that once, late at night, when he was supposed to be asleep, he had woken up thirsty, padded down the hall in his socks, and slipped out toward the garden where he thought he might find his father. Instead, he found her, the bride-to-be, with that same man, their lips pressed together, their hands tangled, their laughter soft but cruel. He described it with the broken rhythm of a child trying to explain something he did not fully understand, and the innocence of it made my stomach twist, because no 5-year-old should know the taste of betrayal this way. I pulled him close, smoothing his hair, trying to hush the tremor in his voice, but inside my fury burned brighter, because this was no childish fantasy, no nightmare he had imagined in the dark. His trembling details matched the filth I had just seen beneath the linen, and it struck me that the only truly honest soul in this entire hall was the one person too small to be noticed. The realization broke me and hardened me at the same time, because while the adults drank and cheered, too blind or too foolish to see the truth dancing at their feet, my grandson had already seen more than enough. He carried the scars of secrets he should never have known, and I realized that while I had failed to speak out years ago when his mother wept in my kitchen, I could not fail him now. His whispered confession was more than evidence. It was a plea for protection, and it ignited in me a fury that silence could no longer contain. Friends, if you are listening now and your heart aches as mine did in that moment, if you have ever wanted to protect someone innocent from the cruelty of liars and felt the weight of being too small, too powerless, then I ask you from the bottom of my heart to subscribe and leave me a comment. I cannot tell you how much it means to know that my story reaches you, that my words do not vanish into silence, but land in the hearts of those who understand. Your support is not just a number on a screen. It is the proof that voices matter, that standing up matters, even when the liars seem untouchable. And when you press that button or share a word with me, you remind me that I am not fighting alone, that women like us carry each other even when oceans separate us. When my grandson lifted his face to mine again, his wide eyes filled with both fear and trust, I felt the weight of his innocence pressing on me like a sacred duty. He had seen too much and understood too little, and the burden of making it right had fallen squarely on my shoulders. I kissed his forehead and held him tight, knowing I could not erase the pictures from his memory, but determined to ensure that those pictures would not haunt him forever. In that moment, I felt the first clear shape of a plan crystallize inside me, fragile but undeniable. I could not expose the truth yet, not in a way that could be brushed aside. But I knew I would, and when I did, it would roar through this hall with the force of thunder. My grandson's whispered secret had given me the strength I lacked, and I swore silently that before this night ended, the lies would be stripped bare, and no one in this room would ever again look at her the same way. The hall pulsed with music and chatter, waiters gliding through with trays of champagne and plates of roast beef, laughter rolling over the polished floors like waves. But none of it touched me anymore, because beneath the mask of a polite guest, I had become something else entirely. Something sharper, harder, a woman who no longer trembled in silence but calculated her every move. My grandson sat quietly pressed against me, his little head on my arm, and while he tried to lose himself in the distraction of the glowing cake at the far end of the room, my mind was already racing, pulling together every detail, every crack in the illusion into the beginning of a plan. They thought me weak, but they had forgotten that silence is not weakness. Silence is patience sharpening its blade. I slid my phone from my purse, careful, slow, my fingers steady even as my heart thundered, and angled it just enough to capture the shadows beneath the table. Every stolen touch, every shameless gesture, every proof of betrayal they believed untouchable. Each second of footage felt like fuel, like fire pressed into my hand, because I knew that when the moment came, this evidence would not only destroy her, but humiliate her in the very space where she had thought herself queen. My rage did not burn hot anymore. It had cooled into something far more dangerous, a quiet, focused storm that waited for the right strike. I smiled at a guest who passed our table, nodding politely while under the cloth of my purse, the red circle on my screen kept turning, recording, preserving their arrogance. As I filmed, memories flooded me again, but this time they no longer broke me. They built me, because every tear I had watched his first wife shed, every night my grandson cried in confusion, every humiliating whisper I endured in town about my son's new woman became bricks in the wall I was now constructing inside myself. I had been powerless then, too afraid to speak, too afraid to lose what little hold I still had on my son, but tonight that fear turned to steel. I realized that if I allowed this farce to stand, if I let them mock the vows of marriage at the very altar of family, then I would betray not only the child beside me, but every sacrifice I had ever made. And so I sat, smiling, clapping at speeches, playing the part of a woman happy to see her son marry again, while inside I held the certainty that before the night ended, masks would fall and truth would scream louder than music. The rage inside me no longer boiled, but pulsed in rhythm with my heartbeat, a quiet drum that kept me steady as I mapped out the path ahead. I would not scream in the middle of the dance floor. I would not hurl accusations they could twist into jealousy or spite. No, I would wait until the stage was theirs, until every eye was locked upon them, until the moment of their greatest pride. Only then would I strike, and when I did, there would be no denying, no covering, no twisting the truth, because it would stand undeniable in front of everyone they had tried to deceive. I lowered my hand to my grandson's back, steady and protective, and whispered silently to myself that patience would be my weapon, and when the time came, I would not miss. The moment arrived with the sharp ring of silver against crystal, the signal for silence, and the crowded hall obeyed, voices trailing off until only the hum of anticipation remained, every eye fixed upon the glittering couple at the head of the room. My son, flushed from wine and pride, lifted his glass with the shaky authority of a man convinced he had finally conquered his demons, his arm wrapped around the waist of the woman he believed was his redemption. She basked in the glow of it, her gown catching the light, her smile stretched wide enough to break her face, and the guests leaned forward with hungry eyes, ready for the speech that would immortalize their love. But my blood boiled at the thought of another lie spoken into that microphone, another moment of praise for a woman whose vows were filth. My heart pounded like a drum, steady and cold, and before doubt could steal my resolve, I rose from my chair, my grandson's tiny hand gripping mine as though to anchor me. A ripple of surprise spread through the room. The mother of the groom interrupting at the most sacred moment, the one designed to seal the night in golden memory. Whispers darted across the tables like sparks, confusion etched into painted faces, but I did not falter. I walked toward the stage with steps that felt heavier and lighter at once, the weight of years of silence finally lifting as fury propelled me forward. I reached the speakers, my hands steady despite the roaring in my ears, and with a deliberate click, I connected my phone. The silence that followed was suffocating, so thick you could hear the faint buzz of the chandeliers, a pause so loaded it threatened to split the air itself. Then I pressed play, and the truth came pouring out. The sounds filled the hall with brutal clarity. The scrape of chairs shifting beneath the linen, the soft laughter meant only for two, the unmistakable rustle of fabric, the wet catch of breath as stolen touches crossed lines that should never have been crossed. At first the guests froze, their faces slack with disbelief, but then the gasps erupted, spreading like wildfire, followed by nervous laughter, hands clamping over mouths, and eyes wide with shock and thrill. Some turned away, muttering in horror, but others leaned in with the greedy delight of spectators at a public execution, their phones already rising to record the downfall. My son's glass wavered in his hand, his knuckles white as stone, and his face drained of color until only his eyes remained, hollow and stunned. The bride's head snapped toward me, her smile collapsing into a snarl, and she lunged for his arm as though she could hold him in place with sheer force. But he pulled away, trembling, as though her touch burned. The hall dissolved into chaos, voices layering into a storm, some shouting denial, some whispering confirmation of old suspicions, others laughing cruelly at the irony of a mistress exposed at her own wedding. The bride shrieked above the noise, her voice cracking, calling me a liar, insisting it was doctored, but the sound of her own breathless laugh under the table betrayed her more thoroughly than any accusation could. The guests were no longer hers. The tide had turned, and every head swiveled with contempt, pity, or vicious glee. My grandson pressed into my side, his eyes wide but unafraid, because he felt the shift too. The moment when truth, long buried, ripped itself free and demanded to be heard. And for the first time in years, I felt light. I felt unshackled, because I had torn open the curtain of deceit and exposed the rot festering behind it. She could scream, she could claw, she could deny until her throat broke, but the truth had been unleashed into the air, echoing from the walls, etched forever in the minds of every witness. The queen they had crowned minutes earlier now stood naked in shame, her throne crumbling beneath her, and I, the quiet grandmother shoved into the shadows, became the hand that toppled it. The bride's face twisted as though the sound of her own voice played back through the speakers had burned her skin, and she stumbled backward, clutching at the table for balance, while the laughter and whispers of the crowd swelled like a tide ready to drown her. She shrieked that it was a lie, her manicured hands waving in the air as though she could claw the truth away, but her own gasps and breathless laughter echoed through the room, undeniable, mocking her with every second. The more she screamed, the more people turned from her, their faces sharp with contempt. The same faces that had smiled at her moments before now hardened into a jury she could not escape. Her parents sat frozen in their chairs, their heads bowed in shame, unable to meet a single gaze, and her maid of honor, the woman who had praised her devotion minutes earlier, shrank into her seat, pale and trembling, as if she wished the ground would swallow her whole. The throne the bride had built for herself crumbled in an instant, leaving her grasping at air, her diamonds flashing not with glory, but with desperation. My son, who had been so blind, so drunk on his pride, stood like a statue with his glass still trembling in his hand, his face drained of color until he looked more ghost than man. He had toasted to loyalty, to love, to a future he thought he had secured, and now the lies lay bare before him, cut open and rotten for all to see. His mouth opened and closed, but no words came, only the slow dawning of a fool realizing he had been nothing more than a pawn in her cruel game. When the bride reached for him, her hands clawing at his sleeve, her voice breaking with desperate pleas, He jerked away with a violence I had not seen in him since childhood, his voice hoarse and raw as he spat that she must not touch him. It was not a shout of anger, but the cry of a man collapsing under humiliation, the sound of a son who had gambled everything and lost it all in front of the people whose respect he craved. And in his eyes, hollow and wet, I saw the cracks forming, the first flickers of recognition that I, his mother, had carried the truth he had refused to see. The hall was no longer a wedding. It had turned into an arena, a theater of downfall where every guest played their part as spectator and judge. Some covered their mouths in shock. Others whispered gleefully, their words slicing through the air like knives. I always suspected. She was never faithful. How blind could he be? Phones glowed in dozens of hands, recording the collapse for the world outside, making sure that this humiliation would not end when the night did, but would spread like fire through every corner of our community. The bride tried to scream over them, tried to call me bitter, jealous, tried to claim the recording was forged, but each denial only dragged her deeper into the pit, because her voice betrayed her, her laughter branded her. Her arrogance had left too clear a trail. She raged like a cornered animal, but the crowd was merciless, feeding on her downfall, their eyes bright with cruel satisfaction as the queen who had strutted in minutes earlier now stood stripped, her silk gown clinging heavy to her shaking frame, her glittering jewelry transformed into chains. And through it all, I felt a wave of release crash through me. Not joy exactly, but something sharper, sweeter. The vindication of a wound finally bleeding clean after years of festering in silence. I had been the quiet one, the woman no one listened to, the mother pushed to the side, the grandmother left to sit in shadows. But tonight I had become the voice that shattered lies, and the sound of that shattering would never be forgotten. My son's eyes, though broken and hollow, finally turned to me, and though he did not speak the apology I longed for, the recognition in his gaze was enough. Recognition that I had been right, that my silence had not been weakness but patience waiting for the right strike. The bride crumbled before us, her sobs tearing through the chaos, her arrogance melted into ashes, and I stood taller than I had in years, steady and unshaken, knowing that the proud had fallen and the scales of justice had begun at last to tilt back into balance. The hall never returned to its former splendor. No amount of music or laughter could mask what had been unleashed. The bride, once radiant in silk and diamonds, had collapsed into a shrieking mess, her voice cracking as she tried to claw back dignity that was already ashes in everyone's eyes. She stumbled against the tables, knocking over glasses, wine spilling like blood across white linens, her sobs turning into curses aimed at anyone who dared to look too long. Guests pulled back from her as if she carried a contagion, some whispering cruelly, others shaking their heads in pity, and still others laughing with open delight, their phones raised high to capture every shameful second. Her parents rose at last, their faces carved in stone, no longer proud but humiliated beyond repair, and they dragged their daughter toward the exit as though she were no longer their jewel but a stain they wanted to wash away. She had walked into this hall as a queen, head high, smirk sharp, but she left it as a ghost of her own arrogance, a spectacle of downfall that would be remembered in whispers long after the chandeliers dimmed. My son stood in the ruins of his own celebration, a man stripped bare before the very people whose approval he craved. He tried to hold his ground, but his knees seemed weak, his voice strangled in his throat, his eyes darting like a trapped animal. For the first time all night he looked at his son, really looked, and saw the small boy who had sat in silence, ignored, his face pale with fear, while his father toasted lies. The recognition struck him hard, carving deeper wounds than betrayal alone ever could, and he reached out a trembling hand toward his child as if desperate to anchor himself to something pure. but my grandson turned his face into my arm, refusing him, and that rejection pierced my son more deeply than all the whispers of the crowd combined. I could see it in his eyes, the sudden crushing realization that he had not only lost a wife, but had nearly lost his child's trust forever, and that wound, unlike humiliation, would not fade with time. For once I did not move to comfort him, because pain was the only teacher left for him now. When we stepped outside, the night air cut sharp and clean against my skin, a balm after the suffocating perfume of lies and false smiles that had filled the hall. My grandson's small hand nestled firmly in mine, and though his steps were unsteady at first, I felt him straighten, his shoulders rising as if some great weight had been lifted. The secret he had carried was no longer his to bear alone, and the relief in his eyes, though shadowed, gave me strength. I whispered to him that he was safe, that nothing he had seen was his fault, and he nodded slowly, the wisdom of a child far too young etched into his gaze. I knew the memory would not vanish overnight, that scars would linger, but I also knew we had broken the cycle of silence, and that gave me peace. For the first time in years, the quiet inside me did not feel like chains, but like open space, and it tasted sweeter than any toast, sweeter than any slice of cake, sweeter than all the empty promises of loyalty shouted into a microphone. It tasted like freedom, the kind you cannot buy, the kind you earn when you finally choose truth over fear. And so the night ended not in music or dancing, but in justice, loud and unflinching, delivered in the very place where lies had strutted so boldly. The bride lost her crown, her name burned into scandal, her arrogance torn apart by the very crowd she hoped to impress. My son lost his illusions, his pride gutted, but perhaps he gained the first fragile chance to see clearly again, if only he chose to grasp it. And I, the woman pushed to corners, the grandmother dismissed as weak, walked away stronger than I had ever felt, holding the hand of the child who had given me the courage to fight. The balance had been restored, and the lesson etched deep into the night was simple enough for even a child to carry. Never build your happiness on the tears of others, because those tears will rise like a flood and wash you away. As we stepped into the quiet street, I whispered to myself the words that would carry me forever. Patience is not weakness, silence is not defeat, and no matter how long it takes, truth always finds its way into the light. If you've listened all the way through, I want to ask you from my heart, please subscribe, leave a comment, and hit that like button. Tell me what you felt while hearing this story. Tell me if it reminded you of something in your own life, because your words and your support mean more than you think. They give me the strength to keep sharing these stories. They make me feel that I'm not talking into silence, but sitting at a table with friends who truly understand. So don't be shy. Drop a few words below, because together we make sure these voices are never ignored.